Hello, welcome to Imagine Love Romance Stories. I'm Danny. And tonight, I will be your guide as we travel to the autumn woods of New England and follow the story of two strangers falling in love against the backdrop of falling leaves, crackling fires, and cozy nights under fluffy blankets. Before we begin, however, relax/prepare for sleep. Let us take a moment to relax and find comfort in the space that we are in here and now. As you close your eyes, allow your body to sink into the mattress underneath you. Right now, I invite you to simply be. You don't have to do anything in this moment, except listen my voice as I guide you to a place of further relaxation. Try and imagine yourself by the perfect bonfire. What does it look like? Are you deep within the woods, wrapped in a fluffy cashmere blanket? Are you sitting in a penthouse suite, watching the fire crackle against the backdrop of the sparkling city lights? Are you sitting surrounded by autumn leaves, with all your friends and family by your side? Listening to the chirp, 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 chirp of crickets nearby? Wherever you are, I want you to try and turn your attention to the warm flames of your bonfire. Picture their color. Are they red like a juicy, ripe apple in an autumn orchard? Or are they orange, like a jack-o'-lantern glowing bright in the dead of night on the steps of a farmhouse? Watch as they crackle, 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 crackle. And as you breathe in, imagine the flames growing, 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 growing. As you exhale, imagine them shrinking, 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 shrinking. Watch as your breath empowers and relaxes the flame, just as it does the same thing in your own body. You breathe in, bringing warmth, welcoming comfort, and you exhale, providing relaxation and ease. Now that we have taken the time to relax and find comfort in the space that we are in, let us begin our story. True love comes quietly. In the hills of Vermont, autumn would not arrive quietly or subtly. It would start with a single tree in a sea of green. The locals would all drive by it and smile, knowing that their favorite season was days away from sweeping across the mountainside, from brightening their towns, and urging the harvest of their fields. What was a single tree one morning would be two trees the next, and 3, 4, 5, 6 in the following days. The vibrant reds, browns, and oranges would bloom across the landscape like a spreading fire, igniting everyone with passion about the season. And for Sage, this year was no different. When she awakened on the first real autumn day, there was a change in the air that was blowing in through her open window, causing her orange curtains to billow. The air of summer had disappeared. The scent of lilacs, freshly mowed lawns, flourishing forests, and ripe, sweet strawberries had faded seemingly overnight. And in its place, the smells of autumn were in full swing. The air had a bite to it. It was invigorating, even at this early morning hour. Sage swore she could smell the ripe apples growing on the gnarled apple trees on the far hillside. She could smell the earthy aroma of leaves hitting the mossy ground. She could smell the spiced cider, the dry warmth of harvested wheat and hay, the sweet spice of pumpkin. The world smelled alive in a way it didn't during summer. It was as if the atmosphere was inviting you to do as you please. If you wanted to curl up with a book and drink a steaming cider, you were welcome to. If you wanted to venture out into the woods and explore the splendor of the falling leaves, you were welcome to. If you wanted to meander through corn mazes and pick apples under the sunset over the horizon that was ablaze, you were welcome to. And on that first fall morning, Sage decided that she wanted to do all three. She rose from her sheets and wrapped herself in the warmest sweater she could find. She slid on her boots, a necessity for traversing the soft autumn ground, and she began her trek outside. She took an even deeper breath of that fresh air. She felt as though she was in some fall storybook from her childhood. There was a magic in the air that couldn't quite be found in other seasons. A magic that she welcomed wholeheartedly. Wanting to enjoy the weather, she opted to hop on her old cruiser bike and start the journey down. Down, down, down the dirt road, past farm after farm. All the farmers were busy in the fields, harvesting their crops. The air was rich with aromas of ripe fruits and vegetables, and of the delicious dishes slowly being prepared with them. Sage waved to each farmer she passed. They all smiled, happy to see her. Sage had grown up in the small town of Cranberry Cove, a beautiful little town nestled against the mountains and a large lake flanked by farmland on the outskirts. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, where there were always people ready to help you, whether you requested their help or not. Sage felt as though she was flying through the autumn air. By the time she arrived at the farm at the very end of the road, she was full of a joyful energy that was contagious to everyone she passed by. The farm she arrived at was a staple in the autumn months. A farm with a large corn maze, with acres and acres of apple trees to pick apples from, and with a dense forest, with a nice trail for a vibrantly colorful nature walk. It was the perfect place to experience all that the season had to offer, and Sage decided that she'd like to start with the corn maze. She grabbed a map and descended into the maze. All around her, corn stalks rose so high they seemingly touched the sky. It felt cozy and exciting all at once, a safe adventure where you could simply explore. Sage loved to meander through the maze without too much of a purpose. For her, it was about being somewhere away from it all. Being somewhere where she could stand still with nature and listen to the sounds and breathe the smells of the season around her. However, Sage wasn't quite expecting what she found around a corner in the center of the maze. For quite some time, she had been wandering through the rows of corn by herself, only hearing the sounds of children and close friends giggling behind the stalks. But as she rounded the corner, she walked directly into someone standing in the middle of the aisle, trying to decide which path to take. She was so surprised she let go of her map and watched as it drifted down, 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 until it plopped into a puddle. She apologized profusely to the man, and when she finally looked up and caught his eye, her heart leapt out of her chest. The man before her smiled apologetically. His eyes were a dark warm amber, so deep and intricate that she felt as though she could get trapped in them. His smile was equally warm, and not forced in a way that so many people's smiles often are. He extended his hand to her, to help her get more steady on her feet. The man, Casper, was equally enthralled by the woman before him. She had an energy about her that promised that adventure and joy were always just around the corner. Even in the moment of surprise, there was still a spark in her light green eyes, which shimmered and shined like the forest floor after a gentle rainfall. "It's all right, it's my fault, after all," Casper chimed. "I'm the one who doesn't know where I'm going." Only then did Sage look a little more inquisitively at Casper. He wasn't dressed like a local. He wore a warm, vibrant blue wool sweater and perfectly tailored pants. His hair fell in curls around wire-rimmed glasses, and slung around his neck was a camera. Sage invited him to join her with a smile laced on her face. After all, she couldn't just leave the tourists to be lost in the maze. Casper chuckled at her little dig and gestured toward the maze, inviting her to lead the way. As they walked, Sage learned more about Casper. He grew up in the city and had worked for several companies as a photographer. However, the commercial life just wasn't meant for him. He sold everything he owned and hit the road to photograph the country over the course of a 2-year trip, a 2-year trip that he was almost certain would be extended. He wasn't exactly sure what he wanted for his long-term future, mainly because he simply liked too many places. Sage found herself mesmerized by this strange, wonderful man's story. He had given it all up in search of something. And clearly, it was in search of something he wasn't even sure he would find. For now, he was just chasing sunsets across the country, stopping wherever his heart desired and trying to sink into each and every community he passed along the way. He asked Sage about her life. How had she ended up in this town? Sage's story was much different from Casper's, although, in some ways, they were almost exactly the same. Sage grew up in this town. She was born and raised here. She played in the creeks and streams on warm summer days as a child. She sledded down the icy hills and skated on the sleek ponds as a teenager. She studied in the old stone library that was nestled at the foot of the mountain. And she learned to drive on the ancient oak and maple-lined streets that laced through neighborhoods full of Victorian houses. Rather than going to college, she too had set out into the world without a plan. She decided to travel around the country, stopping wherever her heart desired, embarking on whatever adventures came to her that day. And when she was done, she wanted to come home. She missed the smell of the woods here. She missed the bubbling melody of the river as it coursed through their little valley. She missed the tang in the air as winter descended, sweeping across the landscape, and inviting everyone to enjoy cozy nights inside, curled up with a blanket and a book. In fact, she had returned here to write a book of her own. Every morning, she'd bike down to the little library, and do her writing and reading, just as she had as a young child all those years ago. While most people in the town would smile politely at Sage's story, Casper was fully engaged. His eyes lit up as he asked Sage all about her travels and about her book. Where did the idea for it come from? What was her inspiration? The two talked for what seemed like an endless amount of time. As they weaved through the rows of corn, it felt as though they were in a world of their own. Their journey's soundtrack was the swish, 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 swish of the corn swaying in the sweet autumn breeze, and the crunch, 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 crunch of the earth underneath their feet. Before long, they had found their way out of the maze. When they emerged from their small world into the rolling hills of the farm, it looked more beautiful than ever. They hovered there for a moment, their conversation still flowing, their bodies inching closer together, as if the maze had closed in on them. Sage asked him what else had he planned on seeing that day. He admitted that he had never experienced autumn before. Being from a southern city, this was his first time seeing the leaves change. His first time in a corn maze, his first time smelling the sweet, earthy aroma of ripe pumpkins growing in the loam. Without hesitating, Sage invited him to join her. Of course, if he wanted a real, local autumn experience, who better to show him around than a local? Casper was delighted by her offer. It was more than he ever could have hoped for. Sage kindly took him by the hand and led him to their very first fall activity, a staple that all the local kids grew up doing. They were going to pick apples. She led him into the far orchard, which was a spectacle in itself. The orchard sat on a particularly hilly part of the farm. The trees stretched far to the horizon, in perfectly straight lines over the natural dips and dives and curves of the landscape. Casper took a deep breath of the air as he meandered through the soft, dark green grass. There was a freshness in the air he had never experienced before, a bite to it. As if the world was begging you to pay attention to the splendor it was providing all around. It smelled like an apple candle, warm and cozy and sweet, and yet, there was a natural freshness to it. He could not only smell the ripe, juicy apples, but he could also smell the earthiness of the leaves as they wavered in the blowing breeze. He could smell the spiciness of the bark that children had been lovingly climbing for generations to reach the best apple at the very top of the tree. He could smell the comforting aroma of the old wood and iron boxes provided for people to pile up their harvest in. He stood in the breeze for a moment, simply breathing in the air that was unlike anything he had ever smelled. When he opened his eyes, Sage was already up in the tree. She sat on a branch casually, one leg dangling down as she reached to gently pluck a ripe apple from a tall branch. She looked as though she belonged up there. She was practically glowing in the soft autumn sun, her hair billowing around her in that fragrant breeze. Casper watched her for a moment, simply observing her do something that was such an innate part of her. Sage began to gently toss apples down to Casper. He caught each and every one and tucked them away into the white bags they had been provided with. Once a bag was full, Sage patted the branch next to her. Casper was hesitant. Sure, he had climbed fire escapes, but he'd never scaled a tree before. With a shrug and a smile, he hauled himself up on the branches and clumsily sat beside Sage, his heart pounding in the best way possible. She smiled at him with a bit of pride and admiration. With a chuckle, he told her, "That was my first time climbing a tree." Sage smirked as she softly told him, "It shows." The two found themselves laughing up in the branches. Though they weren't particularly high up, it gave them a new, wonderful perspective. They were no longer observers of this nature and this landscape. It felt as though they were part of it. "And you know the best part of this?" Sage asked, smiling at Casper. She reached across and grabbed an apple. She handed it to Casper, inviting him to bite into it. He'd never eaten an apple straight off the tree, and certainly not while he was sitting in a tree. But with a shrug, he went along with it. As soon as he bit in, he knew that this wasn't an ordinary apple. It was the sweetest apple he had ever had, packed with flavor and bite and crunch. It was entirely different from the apples he had had from the grocery store. They sat up in that tree for quite some time, their legs dangling as they finished their apples, laughing and telling stories all the while. Every once in a while, Casper would catch himself gazing at Sage for a second too long. It was easy to become transfixed on her. The way those green eyes shone, the way she spoke with her hands, the way she kicked her head back when she laughed. And whenever she caught him staring, her cheeks would flare just a tinge. More than once, Casper tried to convince himself it was just the red of the apple reflecting on her cheeks. Finally, When their apples were finished, the two climbed down from the tree. Caspar put his hand out, helping her down. Though it was probably him who needed help more. When they were down, they both had a newfound energy, excitement about what the rest of the day had in store for them. Once more, Sage took him by the hand and led him through the farm. They meandered through the fields that were flourishing with ripe vegetables. Around them, large pumpkins clung to their vines. Their orange skin nearly as bright as the leaves that Sage and Caspar were walking toward. Caspar was in awe as they entered the walking trail in the woods at the edge of the farm. All around them, the forest was ablaze with the colors of fall. Every once in a while, a cool, fresh breeze would blow, and autumn leaves would come drifting down, 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 down. Like the most beautiful rainfall on the planet. Here, they walked mostly in silence. It seemed that the forest around was speaking for them and the creatures within it. With the cold of winter on the horizon, all the creatures of the forest were busy getting ready to settle down in their cozy dens for a few months' time. Squirrels regularly scampered across the forest path in front of them, chittering the entire way until they adeptly leaped up into the trees high overhead. The birds were even more talkative than usual. Their songs rang through the forest, echoing off trees as they called to one another. It seemed every few hundred feet, a cardinal would swoop through the trees ahead of them, his bright red coat matching the vibrant leaves silhouetting him. It was strange to Caspar how the forest was so utterly alive, and yet, it felt stuck in time at the very same moment. It was as if nothing outside this forest mattered. The bills, the obligations, the struggles. They all faded away, and all you were left with was the beauty of nature. And the world. Time moved slower here. Time moved as it was meant to move. And as they rounded a corner near the bubbling river, time seemed to stop. Because standing before them, wading through the cool water, was a beautiful doe. Its fluffy fur was flecked with white patches. Its plush ears and tail seemed to sway and move with the breeze. They watched in awe as the doe leaned down, taking a nice, long drink of the moving water. There was such a grace in her movements. Something sacred about them. The energy around her was one of kindness, nurturing, and belonging. She was the gentle mother of the forest and all things within it. Caspar could have stared at her for hours. When she turned her gaze to them, there was no fear in her eyes, no surprise. It was as if she had known for quite some time that they would be joining her here at some point. Her eyes were a mahogany brown, nearly the color of the bark coating the trees around her. Without much fanfare and without a hurry, she continued to wade through that coursing river, until she reached the other side. Casting one final look over her shoulder, perhaps a look of gratitude or a look of understanding, she disappeared into the fiery-colored forest. Caspar and Sage stood there for a long moment, soaking in the experience that they had just shared. After some time to breathe, Caspar took Sage by the hand, and they continued over the rickety bridge on the river. "Thank you for showing me this, Sage," he muttered. The tone in his voice showed Sage how wonderful and meaningful the experience truly had been for him so far. And she couldn't help but smile, because she knew what they were going to find at the end of the path, the overlook. As they emerged to the top of the hill, Caspar looked stunned. The path they had been climbing wasn't particularly steep. Yet, over time, it wound up the side of the hill until you were overlooking the entire town. and what they saw was a town straight out of a fairy tale. It seemed every tree in the valley was alight with the colors of fall, as if a paintbrush had been swept across the landscape, coloring the trees vibrant reds and oranges and yellows and browns. It was so warming and comforting to look out over and see. Casper and Sage stood there for what seemed like hours. He took pictures. He hadn't taken a picture of the doe earlier, but he hadn't felt he needed to. That moment was something sacred to be shared between him and Sage, not one that needed to be shared with the world. In his pictures of the town, he captured moss-coated cobblestone streets, Victorian houses coated in a blanket of orange leaves, candles and lanterns glowing in the windows of houses on tree-lined streets. Finally, they began their journey back down, 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 into the very town they had been gazing at only moments before. They had experienced all the farm had to offer. But Sage promised there were more fall things to experience. She led him down to the town center, where there was a pavilion nestled against the river. The pavilion was surrounded by trees, with long swaths of garden and seating for people to sit back and enjoy the views of the town. They sat down on a wooden bench on the far side of the town center, where a fire pit sat before them. As the sun began to set and the colors of the sky began to match the colors of the trees around them, Sage and Casper got to work gathering wood for the fire. It didn't take long for the wood to ignite and fire to grow and grow and grow and grow. Casper watched in amazement as that single ember became the crackling bonfire in front of them. The fragrant, natural, minty smell of the wood was both invigorating and relaxing at the same time. Casper would close his eyes on occasion, listening to the fire crackle, 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 accented by the sounds of the remaining crickets chirping into the afternoon air. Casper felt all his tension melt away. Any doubts he had about this trip, any doubts he had about his future, they no longer existed. All that mattered right now was sitting by this bonfire, surrounded by autumn leaves, his fingers intertwined with Sage's. It's true, they had only met a few hours ago. And yet, they felt closer to each other than they had felt to anyone in quite some time. As they wandered through the beautiful landscape, they talked about their dreams, their hopes, their shortcomings. They had embraced the changing landscape as they had embraced their rapidly changing relationship. As the night air cooled even more, Sage curled up against Casper. He wrapped an arm around her, drawing her close to keep her warm. She lay on his shoulder, feeling utterly safe and content in his arms. They smiled at each other on occasion, but mostly they sat in a comfortable silence, watching the flames dance before them. Soon, the sky overhead was alive, too. Millions of stars shone brightly in that pitch-black sky. And, even more incredible, out here so far from the city, they could make out the haze of the Milky Way. Casper had never seen something so beautiful. When it was time to say goodnight, Casper rode with Sage back to her home to walk her to the door. They hovered in that doorway for quite some time. A million unsaid things floating between them. Unable to say them all in the few minutes they had, Sage leaned forward, pressing her lips against Casper's. It was a kiss of passion, of connection. In that moment, they both felt whole. I think I'm going to stay in this town for a little bit, Casper whispered against her lips, adding, I at least need to see the rest of autumn, don't I? Sage smiled as she whispered. And then winter comes. Surely, you'll want to get some photos of the snow. Won't you? Casper replied, I think I might. With that, Casper climbed back on Sage's bike, which she allowed him to borrow, and he began the ride back to his hotel. He felt utterly free. Riding that bike through the countryside, gliding up and down over hills. Feeling as though he was suspended by the stars, feeling as though he was sailing. Through apple orchards and forests ablaze with color, it was unlike anything else on earth. As he lay down in bed in the cozy inn, he found himself smiling. It was his first autumn. And he knew it was going to be one of the best experiences of his life. I hope you have enjoyed this story and it has brought you a night of peaceful, relaxing sleep. Please, join me again tomorrow for another sleep story. Until then, sweet dreams.